Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Hong Kong U and to the music department at the University of Hong Kong. My name is Giorgio Biancorosso. I teach here at the University of Hong Kong, primarily music history, the theory and the history of music. And I'm delighted to be hosting this conversation with Konstantin Lifschitz today. Konstantin is performing a great feat for us here in Hong Kong U, the entire cycle of Beethoven's 32 piano sonatas, and from memory. And we'll talk about that maybe a little bit later in due course. The setup is, I think, very comfortable for us. It may come across as a bit funny to you. It may look like we're engaging in some kind of piano bar performance, you know, 6 p.m., a twilight performance. That's usually how Elton John or Billy Joel would be performing. But he's not going to sing. He will be speaking into the mic, not singing. Well, you feel free to sing if you want. we can do a duet. It's a special pleasure to have Lifschitz here. Not only because this brings back memories from the Art of Fugue, which he performed 2 years ago, and which we also talked about in this very room with my colleague Daniel Chua, but also because Lifschitz has, consolidated since his status as one of, today's greatest pianists. And I think personally, what's so impressive and so moving about his playing is the impression that which I always experience, both on record but especially live, of what I would call the art of performance. Namely, we talked about the Art of Fugue 2 years ago. This talk really doesn't have a title. I would like to title it The Art of Performance. And what I mean by that is the ability to convey the impression as he's playing, that he's shaping the music, that he's shaping the performance before your very eyes, as rather like a sculptor creating a figure out of a block of granite or marble. That's a very, very rare, for me anyway, type of experience, very, very rare thing to come across today. How he does that, I don't know. Perhaps we can ponder this together, and you'll give us some hints. As I have a couple of ideas, which maybe I'll test with you. But this is very, very important because it reminds us of the fact that no matter how detailed and complete the musical work may seem on paper, and it very often is, it takes a performer to realize it. And this performer has not one, but dozens, sometimes hundreds of possible solutions to the riddles that the music actually presents you with. And so he or she has to make a choice. And that's the other thing that I always feel when I hear Lifschitz play, is the impression that everything he does is deliberate, is the result not of some sort of cold or cerebral planning, but a choice, an artistic choice, a fully thought out artistic choice. And this comes through beautifully in the Beethoven cycle, which is all the more impressive given that he's playing all these sonatas back to back and could perhaps easily fall, be tempted to, as it were, employ, repeat certain solutions or certain ideas across different sonatas, which is not the case at all. What I've heard so far, and I've been at 2 of your recitals till now, there will be more, of course, coming up this weekend, is that every sonata is given a very, very special treatment and comes out as a very distinctive, unique piece of the Beethoven puzzle mosaic. So how do you do that, Konstantin? How do you manage to reach this level of detail, to execute each and every sonata in such a detailed, well thought out fashion within a 32 work cycle? How does one do that?
Well, thank you, Giorgio, to begin with, for flattering words. In many of them, I don't feel I quite deserve, but thank you anyway. To your question, we are taught in such a way, especially with what concerns Beethoven, is that Beethoven was very meticulous, very precise in his indications, and that all you have to do is just to look very carefully in the score and let it evolve, so to say, let the musical information unfold itself. You just have to go deeper and analyze and, like you say, make right choices, or try to, at least to make right choices. I mean, sometimes it is really impossible to say what is right and what is wrong, especially with Beethoven. Well, the more I deal with this music, and this is already third time I'm doing this cycle. I started in Lucerne, then it was in Taiwan and Taichung, and now here in Hong Kong. The more I deal with this immense material, I mean, really boundless panorama of these 32 sonatas, the more I realize that it is probably just as valid to say that it's all on the page as it would be back to the ancient Greek drama, to say all you have to do is just to read what was conveyed on the text. I mean, of course, Beethoven, time-wise, is much closer to us than Sophocles, but he left us just as much information, in my opinion, as to what shall we do with this text. This is a very rough material.
And so, why is it that we hear these sonatas differently? The transitions? The play with masses?
I was going to come to this because I take really this as a raw material. Yeah, there is a lot of information, but it is still a very raw material. So I have to really work very much on the instinct basis, on the intuition basis, and allow myself from the beginning, allow myself to be wrong with things. Because if I'm fixed on being right, I will be petrified. I will be totally mesmerized by awe, and I would be hypnotized by this massive figure, which Beethoven really was, and I wouldn't be able to convey his ideas ultimately. So I think what makes my performance hopefully vital is that I'm trying to deal with it on a daily basis, on a minute basis.
And it certainly comes across that way, at least to me. Now, why the whole cycle? I mean, it's a very special kind of choice. You could play the late sonatas. You could play a selection of a few of them. Why the whole cycle?
Well, of course, I've done just the late sonatas or just the selected ones alone or together, combined with other Beethoven music, with the bagatelles, with variations, and so on. Of course, with other composers too. But the whole cycle, 32 sonatas, is a very special, totally unique task, opportunity, challenge, whatever, for any pianist really to test his or her powers, capacities, talents, and limitations too.
You seem to have a penchant for cycles. You've done the Well-Tempered Clavier. You've done Shostakovich's Prelude and Fugues. Yeah. Could you tell us a little bit? I want to sort of draw out more about what it is between you and cycles that seems to work so well.
Well, yes, I like doing these things, but it does not necessarily have to be a cycle. I mean, I think to study just one window of a Gothic cathedral can be just as valid experience as the cathedral in its integrity, in its entirety. But I think to understand why this window is there is impossible unless you've at least once had a chance to see the whole structure. So
you believe that there is such thing as a cycle? Because some of us, some music historians have claimed, well, the cycle is an artificial construction. You put them together in one edition, but in fact, in Beethoven's life, the sonatas represented unique moments which only in retrospect and by forcing the material somewhat can you see them as a whole structure. What's your take on that?
Well, no, I think that after all, it was one man who created all these works since his early age. The first sonata is when he was 23, 24, and the last one when he was 52. So pretty much the whole span of his creative life. and that without interruption, pretty much. I mean, he had period of stagnation, not just for piano, but generally, due to his personal reasons. So, of course, playing this cycle as it is, 32 sonatas, is not something artificial for me. This is one sonata evolves from the other, and they intermingle. They have dialogues, and not necessarily between one and the next sonata, but between sonatas that are years or decades apart. And that is a fascinating thing to observe. Only possible, I think, within a cycle.
Can we say, perhaps too, that what really holds them together is the relationship with the instrument, the struggle and the challenges that the instrument posed to Beethoven as both a performer and a composer?
Well, of course, as pianists, we were extremely fortunate that Beethoven was the pianist. Of course, he composed 10 sonatas for piano with violin and 5 with cello and 1 for horn, and he composed 16 string quartets and the symphonies and so on. But of course, the piano is something that was clearly very dear to him. He composed his symphonies sitting at the piano, as far as we know. So the piano and the pianists were important to him. So we have a lot of evidence how he judged the pianist who performed his work. Very insightful things, actually. So
he was also a great improviser. How does this come across in the sonatas, which, you know, ostensibly are written work,
well, again,
composed as
yes,
opposed to improvised?
Yes, thank you. That is exactly the question that brings us again to the how am I able to keep my performances somehow to the minute vital, even if sometimes it maybe lacks the final perfection and the thought of the entire structure. But I think that aspect is extremely important. Most of the sonatas give us impression of very solid, almost immobile piece of music.
Definitive,
yeah, where we can, there is very little air to breathe, and that's exactly where we need a performer who can overcome the sheer difficulties and the.
In the slow movement of the G major last Sunday, I think was it? I forgot when was your last. Yeah, I really felt that you were, as it were, improvising how or deciding at that very moment, as you were playing it, how to play it. Of course, I'm sure it's part of your, and I've seen this actually written in one of the reviews I've parsed through. That was extraordinary. That somehow you gave the impression that there were a number of roads that could be taken at that particular point, and you took one rather than the other. To me, that's really what's magical about some of your performances.
Yeah, well, the problem with Beethoven is sometimes he tells you to go to the left-hand side, but also tells you don't forget the right-hand side. So you're really at a loss which path
incompatible.
To go. Yeah. I mean, he obviously was such a contradictory man, and he was devoured by yes and no within himself. And the music and the interpretation of his music should reflect that very difficult, at times painful process.
You mentioned the early sonatas, the earliest published sonatas, because of course he composed a lot of piano music before the early piano sonatas, the Opus 2 piano sonatas. And I think he was 25 when they were published, but he composed them, earlier. The piano he wrote those for was very different from the piano
he wrote the last one.
Yeah, of the late ones, for instance. How does this constitute a problem for you, an opportunity, a challenge? Do you see that right away on the printed score? Can you tell us a little bit about the different instruments that Beethoven played for and the difficulty that this might or may not present to you, given that you're playing all of this on one instrument, one and the same instrument?
Mm-hmm. Well, let me begin by saying that up to Sonata number 15, the Pastoral, the inscription on the title page says Sonata for a pianoforte or cembalo. Harpsichord. So now
that's for commercial reasons.
Yeah. Now, can you imagine a piece like a Moonlight Sonata be performed on a harpsichord? I mean, that's
and that too has harpsichord given. As you're absolutely right.
So that already gives us some uncertainty about should we use the pedal, even if Beethoven started periodically to give pedal indication, starting with Sonata number 12. That's the first one in the end of the funeral march and the end of the variation, first movement too, and the last movement as well. But very sporadic indications. But it means that the pedal was at least already available to him. Does that mean that we should not use the pedal in the first 11 sonatas? Of course not, because we're sitting at this instrument that would be extremely boring without the pedal. We would not be able to intrigue the audience even with one movement, let alone 11 sonatas.
You did use the pedal in an interesting way, though, in the Moonlight. Could you? How do you do it? I'm thinking about the first movement.
The pedal indication until his much later pieces was a very rudimentary one. He would say with sordines, that means no pedal, because if you don't press the right pedal, the sordines are open, or without the sordines. So then by pressing the right pedal, you release the dampers, so to say. So he didn't give a particular indication how to use the pedal in the first movement of that sonata, but he said, please use pedal. Just like Schumann always puts the P letter at the beginning of his pieces, and that's it. He just gives you, please use pedal. He never tells you how and where. With Beethoven, sometimes he would give a certain clear advice. For example, in the Pastoral Sonata, in the first movement, there is this very active and hectic development section, very dramatic dialogue. Still no pedal. And then all of a sudden, he requires pedal here. So he wants this very warm kind of wave reach us.
Well, lots of harmonics. This is something he learned from Haydn, probably, to conclude.
And of course, that means that it should be kept very long to pedal, let vibrate until the release for the... So that would be one example of a very special and particular pedal use. Not the same in the Sonata number 14, the so-called Moonlight Sonata, where he, like I said, he just tells us to use the pedal. But I think here pedal is to create a certain atmosphere, which we hear with our inner ear, and so that's how I try to use it.
And how did you pedal? How do you pedal the Moonlight exactly, if you don't mind?
Well, exactly,
demonstrating
I don't know.
it?
Exactly, I cannot repeat, but well, I open already in the beginning, and he says delicatissimamente.
So you strike the hammer when the dampers are already...
Well, both pedals, the left and the right, they create a special kind of color when you mix them, not just one or the other, but two together, and not both all the way down. So when you try to find this balance, and I don't like the left pedal, the mute, or all too clear. So, un accordo so. So far it's fine to mix the pedals, because it's one harmony.
Okay.
But I don't like the pedal on the bar line, because that makes an extra accent, which of course I want to avoid. So pedal has so many different functions, and one of them is to bring an accent or to avoid an accent.
The pedal was also used in the early 19th century to imitate the voice, because once you press the pedal, the way in which the hammer strikes the strings, of course, reminds one of the attack, of a vocal attack, much more. It's less percussive, right?
Of course.
This brings me to to the question of the voice and vocality in general in the Beethoven piano sonatas, which is not very often addressed. But there's so much voice here in the recitative-like passages. Could you speak a little bit about the imitation of the voice that's so implicit in so much of the writing here?
I think in Beethoven, this is a good question. I think in Beethoven sonatas, just the piano sonatas, we have at least two different types of voice usage. One to speak, where he writes recitativo, for example, this one, the famous one.
In the development.
Instead of going directly, he would, and he writes recitativo, espressivo semplice, no cantabile. So that's kind of inserted.
This is from the development, yeah.
Which we did. And so on. And then he has a second type where he explicitly writes cantabile. So he really wants us to sing. The first one is in the slow movement of Pathétique. That's one of the most famous and attractive melodies he ever composed. For that particular reason, that is so singing. And so on. So basically that's a song or a ballad, as it were. And then he would come back to this cantabile inscription many times, and towards the end of his life he would use the German equivalent, because he became rather nationalistic. So starting with Sonata number 27, Opus 90. Second movement says, nicht so geschwin und sehr singbar vorgetragen. So singing kind of execution. It's not exactly cantabile, and of course we don't have this kind of Italian operatic style of melody, but rather lead German. And so on. So this is something very different. And then he writes both Italian and German for the last movement, for the theme of long set of variations of Opus 109. He says Andante cantabile in Italian. So it's kind of a conglomerate of the song and the aria, and then he complements it with a German indication, sehr gesangvoll. So not singbar, but gesangvoll, which is again another kind of nuance to that. So like a song, but not really. Then, of course, he says molto cantabile for the opening movement of the next sonata, Opus 110, which is really one of the epitomes of Beethoven vocal writing for piano. That's already just as vocal as any Chopin piece can get. Then he starts to use the genres that are not generally connected with instrumental music, such as arioso, arietta, cavatina, in one of his late string quartets, Opus 130. And of course the last sonata is with the famous arietta, is molto cantabile again, adagio molto semplice e cantabile. So the singing becomes more and more important. We see more and more espressivo, which comes from voice, not necessarily from singing, maybe also from speaking, and this singing soulful sound of the piano.
How do you negotiate the transitions between these passages in cantabile and some of the more vigorous or even harsh, often juxtaposed, within the same movement? How do you move from one to the other? And
well, that's another thing that Beethoven teaches us or requires from us, is that we need to be extremely flexible and change our attitude within one phrase. For example, the last passage of the famous Appassionata, the first movement, Beethoven starts with a very vigorous fortissimo statement, final statement of the main motive. But immediately thereafter he goes into something very indecisive, and we need to change this. We have this robust quality, so that happens ever so quickly by him.
It's very dramatic, actually, but
Yeah.
not in the sense that most people usually talk about drama in Beethoven as a drama of tone, of tonal areas and so, but really a drama of, you know, different actors, different players, you know, different instruments, perhaps.
Or within one actor, one player, that has to happen. Just like we shift our emotions, especially when we are not in our comfortable situation. We have huge ups and downs, and that goes very quickly. That is one of the signs of that kind of illness, so to say.
Going back to the cycle, to the idea of the cycle of the synoptic view of Beethoven's workshop and private workshop, as it were, as opposed to the symphonies, which is a more public genre. You teach in Lucerne. You have a professorship in piano at the University of Applied Arts and Sciences in Lucerne, in Switzerland, and so I was wondering how you teach these sonatas, and whether, to what extent the teaching connects to the playing, to your own playing as well.
Well, with Beethoven, just like with any other repertoire, basically, I need to find a middle path between trying to give my vision and my idea what I think that music is about, and some of the general problems that have nothing to do with this or another performer. But of course, that's just one side, and the other side, I have to react to what happens in front of my ears, so to say. So I need to find this path in between, and it's not always easy.
Do you see recurrent problems or issues or surprises that come up every time a student picks up Beethoven?
Well, yes and no. No, because I try not to get too fixed in the problems and to react spontaneously. I think that is a very important thing, since our art is so transitory, and the charm of playing is that it cannot be repeated, just like with the theater piece. So I try to react spontaneously, and that's why it would be extremely boring for me just to try to give some bottom line to everything I hear and try to give a final diagnosis. And that's not what interests me, and I don't think it is ultimately important for the students, because they don't come to hear to get the diagnosis. They want to hear the solution. They want to hear suggestions, how they can improve their performance, how they can enhance it, and so on, and tell them how bad and how obvious and how common the mistakes that they make are, would, I think, make them feel even more depressed. So you conveniently forget, actually. So in order not to create a system. No, I'm joking. No, I don't forget. I'm not so far. I'm not oblivious, and I don't have Alzheimer. But I don't have to be so kind of pinpointing things that seem obvious to me.
I'm an amateur pianist. I'm a terrible pianist. I was an amateur pianist now. I only play the keyboard of the computer. And when I started to play Beethoven, I felt, okay, this is for professionals. You know, even the early sonatas, I felt that most of what he wrote,
particularly the early sonatas.
Yeah, in fact, because they're virtuosic pieces, and so I felt a real threshold there needed to be crossed, and I couldn't cross it really. What's difficult about for us common mortals, technically. I mean, once you get past the technical difficulties, you can sort of think about other kinds of difficulties. But what is so difficult about Beethoven? What is so intractable? The sonorities, the balance. What is it that one cannot get, that I couldn't get right somehow?
Well, techno is a Greek word saying art already. So there is no such thing that you do some preliminary work like preparing a piece of canvas and then you start to paint. No, there is no such thing in piano performance, because you have to deal with all these problems, so-called technical problems, pretty much on a second basis, because you have everything together. For example, a phrase would not be difficult unless you had to make the subito piano in the most inappropriate place, which is what Beethoven does every now and then, more often than not. And some of the phrases that would be probably much easier, much more simple, but also much more banal if you ignore his requirements. That is what would make a simple phrase suddenly very difficult.
Can you come up with an example of that, for instance? No.
Well, I will stay with Appassionata in the big opening. After the first fermata, you have this first explosion, and there you have 4 or 5 dynamics within one phrase. So he starts with crescendo to forte, then he goes to piano, which should not be all too soft because there is a pianissimo thereafter. And then fortissimo. And after that, you need to release the pedal and start playing pianissimo again. So that kind of extreme changes in dynamics, which makes the music so impressive and so appealing immediately to us. Like I said, this is one of the most famous examples, but things like that we find pretty much on every page of Beethoven, and this is by far not the most difficult one. And then later in his later sonatas, he starts to play around a lot with tempi at the same time, so that makes this even much more multi-dimensional. The sheer requirements and what he really wants us to do, even if we don't do it to the last comma. But this all needs to mobilize your whole body and your spirit and your intellect and your feeling. And so you could call Beethoven pretty much a fitness center for the soul and for spirit and for brain. And this requires you need to be fit to that.
Yeah, there is a spiritual.
So the real difficulty, apart from writing just devilishly uncomfortable things, such as something you can't just play straight away.
So why is it so uncomfortable? Why does a pianist write? I think Chopin also writes uncomfortable music. Why is it that often pianists, because they're more interested in the sonorities than in the hand, perhaps?
Well, because they don't want the music to be accessible just to them. They want this to be interesting and challenging for other performance, for other pianists.
Now, you talked about the almost cleansing, almost quality of playing all this music, particularly within a relatively short period of time, because of the encyclopedic nature of the artistic challenges that it presents you with. I'd like to hear a little bit about the training, the physical, the physical, training or condition that goes with playing 32 sonatas in 10 days or 2 weeks. The discipline, the mental discipline, the state of mind. Could you give us just a glimpse of what goes on inside of you as you prepare and then execute this, monumental cycle?
Well, the truth is that the more I try to keep regime and discipline and do things the right way, the worse it gets. So
I feared this answer.
Yes, so I'm going to give you quite a disastrous answer to that, I'm afraid. Of course, it's a test for your sheer physics and for your stamina and for the brain and for the memory and so on. But I think the most difficult thing is how do we get all the information that we have about this music while we study and while we try to accommodate this music to our needs, or rather accommodate us to the necessities and exigences of the music. How do we call this back when we are on stage? And when we know we cannot repeat things? Of course, it's one thing you're sitting alone in your study, and you know you can stop any moment, and another totally different situation when you're on stage. So that can be very helpful. That can be also very disturbing factor. That's why it requires this kind of preparation and many life vests, so that you feel safe when you sit on stage, and you know if you're going to have a memory lapse, and you're definitely going to have a memory lapse, because we all have our blackouts in our conscious. That's quite normal and human. So you have to know how you should be prepared. How do you continue? How do you keep the work going, so that the audience really gets the impression of receiving the piece from A to Z.
And you're referring to not just remembering the notes here, but referring to how to play it in that particular way, right?
Everything. The piano goes out of shape. You
have
cannot
to
be
respond to
distracted. You have to respond to that, but you shouldn't get distracted by it. You come to a new acoustics and you notice this is very dry. I need to use much more pedal. I have accordingly to change my phrasing, and that is on the spot, like you say, spontaneously, and that has nothing to do with memory. Even if I have this score, I still have to adjust.
What are the advantages of playing from memory for a pianist? For us, it's a more photogenic, clean experience. No one is around you. No one is turning pages. You are not turning pages. We find it very impressive. We think that perhaps you are more absorbed because you don't have to look at. From your perspective, what is the greatest advantage of not having to rely on a score on stage?
Well, one of the reasons, like you said, I don't want to have another person next to me. Even when I play chamber music with a score, I try to arrange my score in such a way that I don't need a page turner. But sometimes it's not possible. And anyway, if there's a big group of people, a piano quintet or a trio or a quartet, then it's okay to have an extra person next to you. You're already surrounded by so many people. But when you perform a solo sonata by Beethoven, one of the reasons, like you said, it's you get more absorbed. It was Robert Schumann again who said that a chord which you play by memory, by heart, sounds always much more free than the one that you play while looking at the score. So that's just one score, and if you have the whole sonata, you feel a totally different kind of freedom.
You've recorded Beethoven also, so moving from the concert hall to the studio. How does a pianist approach studio recording? You're playing from the microphone in the same way that a dancer is dancing on film, is dancing for the camera, not for an audience in the theater. It's a very different thing, actually.
Yeah, indeed.
So I heard your late sonatas on recording.
Well, that was not a studio. That was actually a live recording.
Oh, okay. So
but I have recorded.
It was very clean, though. It sounded like a studio recording almost. Yeah.
It was a nice hall in Tokyo. But you're right. The difference between a live performance, whether recorded or not, and the actual studio recording is pretty much the same as for an actor who is on stage for a theater piece and the actor who goes into studio and is taken for the film. On one hand, it's easier because you can do as many takes as necessary, and you're not showing, the camera is not showing you all the time. It's just the important moment and the aspects you want to show of yourself. On the other hand, because it is so precise and because people really listen with different ears when they know that this is a studio recording, they really do, that gives you an extra challenge, and you should treat it in a totally different kind of work. So that's a wonderful opportunity where you can sort of paint with your sound much more. You can try different colors because you have this opportunity.
And how does the experience in studio change your, or has it changed your musicianship when you play live? Because that is a big question.
Are you questioning about my overall general musicianship or about my interpretation of a particular piece that I've recorded?
Both.
Let me start with the piece.
Yeah.
When I go to studio to record a piece, I feel after I've done that, sometimes it's a very taxing and very hard and long process to record just one Beethoven sonata. For example, I recorded 10 piano violin sonatas with my partner in studio. So after we've done that, I felt, and we had been touring a lot with this repertoire, with all 10 sonatas. But after the recording, I felt now I really studied this. Now I really know this upside down and in reverse. So that's one thing which is studio great for. As far as your general musicianship, of course, when you sit in a studio with the particularly critical ear of the good sound engineer, then you learn a lot from these people who are just there to be absolutely merciless and sort of extremely penetrating and acribic and meticulous and so on. So you learn a lot. When you work, that could be a minus on stage. Mm-hmm. You should not be too critical when you perform on stage. There you let it go. But in your homework, when you sit in a studio, that's a great thing to be as self-critical as possible, because that's the only way to make some progress.
But there are two different arts, in a sense, playing live and playing in studio.
Yeah. Like
and isn't it difficult to actually not confuse them at times? I'm wondering. Not in your case, obviously.
No, it's not. That part is not so difficult, because when you go on stage and you see this audience, you cannot play as in studio, where you know that you can repeat. You're a different person, and that's very important capacity that we develop since we get to play on stage in a very early age.
You mentioned earlier that you try to approach, particularly when you work with students, every piece as if it were the first time, spontaneously, fresh, as a fresh challenge. I was thinking, when you were talking about that, also about the influence that previous interpretations of the same repertoire, in this case the Beethoven sonatas, and even cycles, as they exist on recordings and so forth, have had on you, and how you've been able to both profit from them and find your own voice, as it were. How does that work? Because it can be haunting, I suppose, to really love an interpretation by someone else and then sort of extricate yourself from it.
Well, for that, I had in the due time, I had received the most valuable advice from one of my teachers. This is a great Chinese pianist, actually, Fu Song. And he said that we should learn a lot from the masters, but much more from the creator himself. That was an old saying for the Chinese landscape painting, where the students tried to learn from their masters, but not so much from the nature. So what really the mountains and the river and the birds and the animals and so on really want to tell you, and what are you supposed to convey. So in the end, a lot of musicians are extremely fantastic copyists of great masters. They can imitate masters and play actually better than some of them. But at the end of the day, you can still hear, if you really listen carefully, you can still hear that there is something artificial and something secondary as kind of surrogate to it. Like the surrogate milk can taste better than the real milk, but you can't call it biological milk. So the same as with interpretation. I think it is very important by saying God who created the mountain. Here we are talking about God, the composer, who created his piece. So you start to look at the piece as if you just received it fresh from the creator. and you deal with it on a very immediate basis.
I asked this also because your first success as a recording artist was the Goldberg Variations, which of course had a very long history of recorded versions, most notably, of course, Glenn Gould, and you still got away with it. So that was quite a statement, I think. You were a very young musician, and how did that work out? How did that happen?
I recorded Goldberg Variations 2 times so far. One when I was 17, and another one just a couple of years ago when I was, I think, 37, 38.
I was referring to the earlier recording. Yes.
Yeah, but I would like to refer to both if you're talking about this, and to say that I think in the first one I was still very much under the spell of Glenn Gould, and people were more impressed not with the quality of the recording as such, but by the fact that this was played by a youngster. This was, of course, a very important factor. Whereas I think my more valuable performance is the one that I recorded much like 20 years later, which, whether you like it or not, shows my evolution as the performing artist.
One more question, I think, touching on Bach. Regarding counterpoint and how to play Beethoven's counterpoint on the piano. How do you approach these passages? Some of which are really just flashes. They cloud the texture, then the counterpoint disappears. In some cases, of course, the counterpoint is sustained and sort of control in Beethoven and controls the texture for a much longer. How does one play counterpoint in this very dramatic, animated context, which is Beethoven's music?
Well, you're probably referring to the big fugue from the Hammerklavier Sonata.
Not just that.
Well, that is when you talk when things tend to become flashy and clouded. That is one piece, because if you get it clouded in the Opus 110 or in Opus 101, then that's just purely pianistic problem, because they're not so challenging, obviously, as this big fugue from the Hammerklavier or from the piano cello sonata, especially the second one, Opus 102, number 2. Now, my ultimate goal is to not to become flashy, to become clear. When Beethoven writes Fuga con alcune licenze, with certain freedoms, he's not meaning to give you idea you can do whatever you want. He wants you to be faithful, whatever it means. Like I said in the beginning, to be faithful to Beethoven is a very abstract abstract thing to say. I'm faithful to Beethoven's text today means very little to me. I need to hear what this performer actually means to hear from the performance. But to be faithful to this counterpoint in this big fugue means to be cold, to be calm, not to let yourself be carried away within this incredibly powerful stream. So I think that is what the audience really appreciates and should value in a performance. If the performer brings you the structures out, but still remains kind of cool in a certain way, because it's a very, very difficult thing to do.
Some of his variation cycles also end with a fugue or a contrapunto, heavily contrapunto. I'm thinking about the Opus 35 and the Diabelli. Do you play the variations a lot, and how do you relate them, if at all, with the sonatas? How do the two bodies of work talk to one another in your?
Well, of course, we have within the body of 32 sonatas, we have number 10, number 12, number 23, number 20. Sorry, Hammerklavier is sort of variation 2, even though it's not officially called. But the fugue is a variation on a slow movement, for example.
32, of course.
Of course, 32, 30. Yeah, so at least 5 of them have the variation, explicit variations. But when you mentioned that the Opus 2 was the first, were the first ones to be published, those were talking about sonatas. He published quite a few sets of variations before, and it's a fascinating thing to look at those variations, because we really have a feeling we get into the laboratory of Beethoven, from where it all evolves, starting with the first sonata, which is of course a masterpiece, but we have some masterpieces amongst his early variations too, and sometimes they would be unfortunately a little bit overshadowed by the sonatas. We're not talking about the famous Opus 35, the Eroica variations, the Diabelli, the 34, the 32 variations, and so on. But this earlier variations, some of them are really very underestimated, in my opinion.
We before this talk, we talked very briefly about period instruments. You know, of course, Beethoven used very different instruments to the ones we're using today, and even in his own lifetime, of course, the piano evolved and changed. He was in effect involved in the, he was talking to instrument makers the whole time.
He was responsible for development of the instrument.
And the music itself, in fact, drove, even after his own death, drove to some extent the development of the piano into what it is today. You mentioned that you learned a lot. You'd rather perform these sonatas with the modern grand piano, but that you've learned a lot from playing with period instruments. Could you flesh that out a little bit, elaborate on that? What does one learn?
Okay, that kind of connects with the previous subject that we touched when I mentioned that he writes for harpsichord. So the most obvious aspect, when you just look at the score of the first sonata, actually any sonata, you notice that Beethoven is limited in his keyboard, that he would write it up till here in the exposition, but then he would have to reduce and change his writing and the reprise in the recapitulation, because he didn't have enough keys to repeat the same thing. Now, for us, of course, it's a wonderful thing. Like in nature never repeating itself, we hear the great master giving another, maybe more charming solution to the same cadence or to the same phrase. We have that, for example, in the piano concertos, number 4 and 5 also. So but that is the most obvious aspect. When we don't have enough bass, enough discount, it is important that we learn another thing from this. When we notice that we learn that we're dealing with a different sonority, we're dealing with a different pedal. We should not take things for granted. When we read keep pedal in the later pieces, like for example in Waldstein Sonata, in Appassionata and so on, we should remember that we're basically playing a transcription of a piece for a different instrument.
Can you maybe give us just a taste of what of how your knowledge of period instruments has changed your performance of the Waldstein, for instance, which we're going to hear very soon, I think, this weekend?
Well, for example, when he writes this long pedal and then no pedal, the contrast on a modern piano that has much less resonance, actually, than that period instrument, makes the contrast way too striking. So we should really adjust the non-pedal to a very abundant pedal, and also going all the way down in the famous opening of the rondo, where Beethoven not only mixes tonic with dominant, but also major and minor. It goes from minor to major. Then he writes no pedal, so if we play literally what he composed, that would sound a little bit like his famous student Czerny, who wrote his famous notorious studies.
So the contrast is too black and white.
Of course I would need that this atmosphere doesn't get lost and makes a nice bridge the next time the theme comes.
What about the famous octaves in glissando at the end of the same movement? What's your take on that? Yeah, you just play them as.
I couldn't play this long time. I had to learn this. But anybody can learn this. This is an easy thing to learn. But you need a good keyboard. It's not good on this kawaii, but it's going to work in the whole life.
Of course, it's a lot easier with the 19th century piano because the action is lighter, so you can really play these glissandos.
Well, that would be another place where I wouldn't be to drive. If I try, I will never be soft enough, and it will be obviously not good. But if I sort of metaphysical idea of this passage.
Now, there are a few students here, and I think we often scold them for not paying attention to what they play from. They just get they take a score and then they just start playing. How does a pianist like you, of your stature, approach an edition or any edition? Do you create your own editions?
Sort of. With Beethoven, you need to create your own edition for that simple reason that, of course, we'd like to think that the manuscript is the final word of Beethoven, whereas very often he changed his ideas for the first editions. And then he was not happy with the first editions too, because he noticed so many mistakes and he already wanted to change. So it's very difficult to judge what is the deliberate and arguable solution offered by his editor or by his copyist, and where is Beethoven himself. So for this performance, I was for this tour with the sonatas, I was studying the new edition of Bärenreiter, which made a lot of sonatas, but unfortunately so far not all of them. There are quite a few missing. So I compared this, and I went through all the commentaries, so I did quite a bit of research. I compared this to the other available urtexts, which are so different within themselves. Again, when we look at Henley and when we look at the Schenker edition or the London edition, they're all supposed to be Beethoven's sine qua non, but they are not, because they already argue with each other. So that's why sometimes it is very difficult, and it does not concern only the phrasing, which also can change, of course, the sense, but the notes themselves. When in the Hammerklavier fugue we have missing accidentals or missing natural signs, we get a totally different character of the piece. When we play one edition says, remain in G major, so no sharps. The other say, both C, so already glimpse of D major coming back. So sometimes I play half-half, or you see already these four different variants change the music so drastically, and there are many examples like this.
Well, thank you for these wonderful shadings between major and minor and different keys. On this note or notes, on this undecided notes, I think we come to an end because time is up, and I'd like you to join me in thanking Konstantin Lifschitz.